Good afternoon. Welcome to the third and last part of this first lecture that's aimed to introduce you to functional grammar. I'd like to start today with a summary of the comparison that we've made in the previous chunks of this lecture between formal approaches to grammar and functional approaches to grammar. And the column that I'd like you to focus on, because it describes the grammar that we use, is this, the second one. So you see, we may want to compare the two approaches to grammar based on four categories. The primary concern, as I've repeated many times during the course of this lecture, formal grammar assigns priority to structure. You remember from last time when I showed you how formal grammar looks at well-formed clauses, whereas functional grammar not only looks at the form of statements, well, it takes them into account, but its primary concern is meaning. Secondly, another dimension we might want to use to compare the two approaches to grammar is the unit of analysis. Now, formal grammar looks at sentences, and it's not by chance that here you see written sentences rather than clauses. In a second I'll explain why, but for now look at this cell where it says whole text, because functional grammar, unlike formal grammar, takes as its basic unit of meaning the text. So yes, it does analyze, clauses do, but its point of reference, the most important unit of meaning, is the text. Right, so to answer the question I asked a few seconds ago, why is it sentences that we find here rather than clauses? Well, it's because, as I told you before, clauses are real examples, and that's an approach that's more practical. Sentences are theoretical objects, whereas clauses are real objects. That's why in functional grammar we prefer to call that particular unit of analysis, which is not the main one in our approach but has a role, clause. Okay, but then we'll elaborate on this, as I promised, as we go along. Our grammatical terminology, our meta-language will become more and more refined. Now, the third dimension along which we might want to compare formal and functional grammar is the language concern. What's a language concern? It means the aspect of language that we focus on most, right? The one that forms the basis of our theory. Now, for formalists, this is obviously syntax, because syntax in turn reflects the primary concern of a formalist, structure. Instead, you see, since our language concern is semantics, it means that the primary concern, the philosophy behind our reasoning, is meaning. Lastly, according to formal grammar, language is a set of rules for sentence construction. For functional grammar, as I told you before, language is not only a social semiotic, but also and primarily a resource for meaning making. Okay? So meaning is, remember that, meaning is our key preoccupation in functional grammar. Structure is more likely to be the main interest of a formalist. All right, so let's look at this diagram that tries to put together some of the keywords that we've been using all along this lecture. Okay, culture, situation. You remember what are these? These are the two dimensions of context. You know, we have a context of culture and we have a context of situation. And as I told you before, both of them are important in order to define the way in which language will be used in any given register. Now, you see at the center, in the central circle, these are three circles, you see, which touch each other. In the central one, we have semantics, the system of meanings, lexicogrammar, the system of wordings, and finally, graphology and phonology. What are these? These are what we call in functional grammar, following the linguist Yelmslow, we call these strata. These are stratification. All right, these are the strata across which language is articulated. And the central stratum is lexicogrammar. As you may remember from the first part of this lecture, I told you that in functional grammar, we should never look at grammar as separated from the vocabulary. They are one. One does not exist without the other. So we should look at them together, and that's why I encourage you to talk about lexicogrammar rather than just grammar. And that's what I'll be doing throughout this course, of course. Then you see above the lexicogrammar, we have the semantics, okay? Because lexicogrammar is the means, the tool through which we can express semantics. What about this? The lowest stratum. The lowest stratum is graphology and phonology. You remember in a previous slide, I called these letters and sounds, and I told you that, of course, whether you use letters or sounds will depend on whether you're writing or speaking. That's the lowest stratum of our model. And why is it lowest stratum? Because, of course, letters and sounds can't make meaning on their own if they're not helped, if they're not instantiated in the lexicogrammar and in turn put within a semantic framework. Okay, now the one you see shown in the stratification circle is the linguistic level of our analysis, but you see the largest circle that includes everything, the situation, the linguistic level, the strata, is extra-linguistic. That's the culture, and that's equally important, right? So this diagram is the text-context connection that I'd like you to study, analyze, and know well. And to conclude this slide, you should remember that language always takes place in context. You remember in the previous part of this lecture, I told you that language does not occur in a vacuum, okay? It's always placed in context, okay? This is fundamental to any kind of functional analysis of language. Now, as I told you, the context should be seen as involving the context of situation and the context of culture. Let's start from the inner circle of the previous diagram. That's the context of situation. Now, that's the nonverbal environment and generally includes who's talking to whom, when and where and how. Okay? And if you remember from the previous part of the lecture, that's articulated into field, tenor, and mode. Okay, last time I told you that field is what's going on, the topic, the subject matter, including participants, including processes, including circumstances, whereas I told you that tenor has more to do with interpersonal aspects of language, so the relations enacted among participants. So if you want to try and probe the notion of tenor, you have to ask yourself who's taken part in the particular language event that you're involved in or you want to analyze. Finally, mode, as I told you before, is the dimension, the meta function that involves the role of language. So if you want to probe the aspects of context, you have to ask, how is language used? What is the role of language? Okay, and these are all notions that Halliday didn't invent out of nothing. Okay, he invented them, but basing himself on empirical studies on the field carried out by a leading anthropologist, Bronislaw Malinowski, who identified a series of functions of language by doing field work in a place called Kilivila, so in an exotic place. But okay, that's only the history of our approach, but you should be aware that once again, this model is not invented from scratch. It is based on empirical research, and I told you last time just how important empirical research is to functionalists, whereas it's not so important for formalists. Okay, now another diagram that we might like to look at concerning the representation of the context of situation. You see, we start from the left hand side. We see field, tenor, and mode. Okay, as I told you, field is the meta function, the dimension of the context of situation that answers the question, what is going on? Okay, and that what is going on problem, the field may also be described as the ideational dimension of the situation. Ideational in the sense that it expresses the reality that we're talking about. Okay, we'll see that together with ideational, there's also another aspect of field that's called experiential. But for the time being, let's stick to what we have on the diagram and talk about ideational. So how do we express ideational meaning? We express it with transitivity. Transitivity is exactly what I told you before about field. It's the expression of meaning that's instantiated in participants, processes, and circumstances. We'll see that in detail. Not now, but in following lectures. Tenor, as I told you before, is the dimension of the context of situation, the meta function that answers the question, who is taking part? And tenor expresses the interpersonal function of language. Okay? And that is instantiated in three systems: the system of mood, the system of modality, and the system of appraisal. Okay? And these are all things that we will see in depth. They're all systems that aim to express the speaker's position towards the situation, towards what he or she is saying at a given moment, and also evaluative language. Okay, that's the function of mood, modality, and appraisal. But we shall see each of them. Now, mode, finally, is the dimension of the context, the meta function that answers the question, what's the role of language? Okay, and that's the textual meta function. Okay, what makes a text a text? If we have a piece of language, how do we know that that's a text rather than something completely unconnected? Well, we know that because of the textual meta function. And the property of a stretch of language to be a text is called texture. Okay? And that texture is instantiated through the system of theme, thematic structure, and cohesion. Okay? We'll see everything, so don't worry now. I only want you to learn these words from the time being and understand them, because a previous understanding of what all these concepts mean is preliminary to study each of them individually and in depth. Right. So, now that we've seen the context of situation, I would like to go on to spend a few words about the context of culture. Now, the context of culture can be understood in terms of all the beliefs, ideas, ideologies, worldviews, and value systems that are constructed in language, or also in a language, okay? Language meaning language in general, and languages being the different languages that you can find. Now, let's go back to register. Register is has to do with the context of situation, okay? And register is defined by the 3 dimension of the situational context that we've seen, so field, tenor, and mode. Now, we've already seen that text, context, language, grammar, they all have an inextricable relation. They can't be separated. One must be analyzed with the other. There's no possibility of separating context from language, from grammar, from meaning. They're all to be seen against the same backdrop in functional grammar. All right. So what do we need the register for? The register is what allows us to place a given text within its context, okay? What makes us, for example, see the difference between a class situation, a chat among friends, a book, a research article, all kinds of different texts that have different contexts. And in order to make sense of these contexts, we need the register. Okay? And register is instantiated in field, tenor, and mode. So the ideational metafunction for field, the interpersonal metafunction for tenor, and the textual metafunction for mode. Now, let's start from field. Field is described by Halliday and his colleague Ruqayya Hassan in their book Cohesion in English, published in 1976. It's a classic. The total event in which the text is functioning together with the purposive activity of the speaker or writer. Okay, as I told you, whenever we talk about text, we not only mean written things, written texts. Texts may also be spoken. Okay? So, field corresponds with the ideational component of register, or metafunction, you can also call it that. Okay? Or you can also call it, remember, dimension of the context of situation. Okay? These are all different kinds of meta language you can use to describe the ideational for field, the interpersonal for tenor, and the textual for mode metafunctions. Okay? They can all be used. So, field determines the system of transitivity. Okay? So, as I told you, processes, participants, circumstances, and another thing that the transitivity system determines is the choice of vocabulary. Why is that? Well, it is because, as you should know by now, in order to probe the nature of the ideational metafunction of field, we have to ask ourselves, what is going on? So what is going on is also expressed through vocabulary. Tenor. Now, this is again taken from Cohesion in English, the book by Halliday and Hassan, refers to the type of role interaction, the set of relevant social relations, permanent or temporary, among the participants involved. Right? So you understand very well from this quotation that tenor has to do with interpersonal relations. For example, that wording you have above should immediately point to the fact that when you want to decide if a text is formal or informal, as we did in the second part of this lecture when I gave you examples of formality or informality, you want to look at tenor. Okay? The formality is something that has to do with tenor. Okay? And tenor determines, as we saw before, the patterns of mood and modality. Now, it also determines appraisal. The reason why I didn't quote appraisal here is that it's a subject that's dealt with in more detail in the second year of this course. So we will only have a very brief cursory look at it, if at all. So for the time being, you should know for this year's course that tenor determines the systems or patterns of mood and modality. Finally, mode. Okay, that's, as I told you before, the role of language. And we've seen in the previous diagram that mode is responsible for the system of theme and the system of cohesion. But there's also another important aspect that mode helps us analyze, and it's the degree of spokenness or writtenness of a text. Now, you may think, well, a text may be either spoken or written, right? How can I find an in-between situation? Well, something that's both written and spoken, or partly written and partly spoken. Well, yes, this situation exists. Well, maybe as digital natives, the first thing you'll think about will probably be chat lines. Yeah, that's a hybrid kind of mode, because, okay, the channel is decidedly graphic because you write in chat lines with your hands on the computer, but the medium is spoken because you don't use a written formal academic register to write in a chat line, do you? Right? You use the patterns of spoken language. So that's a hybrid case. But for example, you may find mixtures of writtenness and spokenness also in more traditional kinds of communication, like for example the news on TV. You know, the news on TV, there's a person that, an anchorman or an anchorwoman that we see on the screen, and she or he is speaking when we watch the news. But that's not spontaneous speech. That's pre-prepared, and it's usually written to be spoken. So the people we see on the news are actually reading. So what they're doing is use a channel that's phonic and a medium that's written. Okay, so you see all combinations are possible. I mean, not all, but many combinations are possible. And you should know the difference between the channel and the medium. Okay, the channel is the physical way in which we emit or perceive a message. Whereas the medium is more complex. It's, for example, it's defined by the lexical density or by the presence of nominalization, but typically we can recognize if the patterns of what we hear or is in a spoken, genuinely spoken, so phonic and spoken situation, or if there's some mixture. Okay, right, another aspect that you want to deal with when you analyze the mode is the process of text creation. So as I said before, if for example we stick to spoken language, that would be the spontaneity of the speech that we're listening to or producing. Okay, that's called process of text creation, how the text was created. That's also part of mode. Okay, so as I said, I would like you to be able to distinguish between the channel and the medium. Okay, the lexical density in functional grammar can also be measured. It's not something that we will do, but be aware that it's also it's possible to calculate it based on how many lexical words there are in each clause. So calculations are possible. It's not something that we make up. It can be worked out in quite precise ways. And okay, grammatical intricacy is also an issue when we decide if the text we have in front of us is in a written or spoken medium. And what you'll be surprised to find out is that actually grammatical intricacy is higher in spoken media, when the medium is spoken. Okay, that's precisely because when we speak in a spontaneous way, we tend to stop, we tend to rephrase what we've just said, we repeat things, and sometimes we change the structure as we go along. Okay, whereas the lexical density is typically higher in written texts, and especially texts that are technical or scientific, because lexical density is often connected with nominalization. Okay, these are all concepts that we'll look at as we go along. Now I want you, for the time being, I want you to know that channel and medium are part of the meta function called mode, and I want you to be able to make the difference between the two. To sum up, to conclude this first lecture, you should have learned that functional grammar does not focus on the structure of statements, although it does recognize the importance of structure, but it focuses on the purposes and uses of language. And it assigns a fundamental role to context, and its aim is not to give you rules on how to write and speak well. Its purpose is to describe how language is used, okay, by showing how meaning is made, and by understanding and revealing why certain choices are favored over other choices in real language, and to understand and evaluate texts in order to gain a full understanding of how our language works.